And we continue with the Christmas series with the 5th day of Christmastide, December 29th. If I had to pick the 5 most influential books in my life, I'd have to say they are The Hound of the Baskervilles, The Silver Chair, Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Divine Comedy, and Around the World in 80 Days. Now, I know there are some snobs out there who'd probably scorn the choice, but this isn't your list, is it? The reason why I chose those books is because each of them influenced my writing. I mean, come on. Now, Hound of the Baskervilles, to me, is one of the finest murder mystery stories ever written. Conan Doyle's stories previously at Sherlock Holmes were rooted in the real world, but this novel took Holmes and deposited him in the world of the supernatural, and he was forced to confront the possibility that a hellhound really was haunting Dartmoor. The atmosphere, the landscape, the dialogue is phenomenal. For me, it's one of those quintessential books you ought to read come October. Hell, I think the story is set in October. Anyway, Hound had a tremendous influence on me as a writer, and all the works I've written, from Bushwhackers to Rebecca and the Spruce, have been vain attempts to replicate that oeuvre. Whether it's the terrible trio in Oz or a young woman being pursued by a living spruce, it's the collision of the fantastical and the realistic elements of the world, and people trying to make sense of it and finding a way to overcome it. But the biggest challenge is trying to replicate the atmosphere. I mean, I can write a story set in Dartmoor with a similar premise, but I could never nail down the same tension and gothic dread that Conan Doyle so expertly employed in that book. Anyone wishing to understand the roots of the Bushwhackers and other stories on the channel need to read Hound of the Baskervilles. The next book, The Silver Chair, is my favorite in the Chronicles of Narnia series. It's an adventure book. Sure, Voyage of the Dawn Treader is an adventure story too, but it's comfortable. There's a huge cast of characters, and there's no real danger apart from the Dark Island. But Silver Chair is minimalistic. It's 3 people traveling up north into the waste, confronting all sorts of danger, from giants to witches, all to find and rescue the heir to the throne. It's Conan Doyle meets Gawain and the Green Knight, basically. I remember sitting in that big brown chair as a kid with that book, just turning the page eagerly to see what happens next, to Eustace, Jill, and Puddleglum. I still have the same copy, the HarperCollins version of the book, and for me it's one of the best adventure stories ever written. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was, for me, my first mature book. I felt I was reading something completely different. Whereas the first 2 books were fictional, this felt very much like reading something that had the possibility of historicity. And Hugo's tangents were surprisingly interesting. Normally going off script into other realms would be infuriating, but Hugo somehow does it with such subtlety that you never notice until you reach the end and are back in the main story. The novel is very introspective and very philosophical. It's gothic without being overly gothic, if that makes sense. The characters are both complex and shallow, and the way they interact is the model for how I've tried to write dialogue. The funniest exchange is the one between Pierre Gringoire and Claude Froyo, where the latter asks about his marriage to Esmeralda, the gypsy girl. I recommend you read it for yourself, but I've tried my best to pattern my dialogue between the characters after that one exchange. It's inane but serious all at once. I could go further, but the book is very much a huge influence on me. And the old Bantam Classics version, that beige book with the painting The Mystery, is my favorite. However, I can't find a good copy these days. The Divine Comedy was a poem introduced to me junior year of high school. My English teacher, Mr. D'Agostino, encouraged me to read it, and I took to it like a fish to water. And soon I was trying to write poetry and stories very similar to Dante, and it's deviated from there. See, that's a good English teacher. Any teacher can get a student turned on to a good book, but the really good ones will inspire you to write. And he certainly did that with me. And I haven't stopped since. But besides that, the Divine Comedy opened up another reality for me. You could go to another world. Multiple worlds, in fact. It's because of Dante that I began writing my own epic poetry. The Fall of Lucifer, Temptation of Christ, Deliverance, Yorktown, Vertumnus all had their influences in me reading Dante. I'll eventually read those poems and post them online, but I don't think I could have written those great works of poetry without a good English teacher prodding me in the right direction. Thank you, Mr. D'Agostino. Around the World in 80 Days is my last book on the list. I remember as a kid going to Little Professors on Park Road, that little blue book with the painting of two men in a balloon, and just reading it over and over again. It introduced me to Phineas Fogg, the eccentric Englishman who makes a bet that he can traverse the world in 80 days. And it certainly introduced me to the concept of eccentric characters. And he surrounds himself with equally strange people. The valet, Passepartout, Mr. Fix, the detective, and Auda. Each of them possessing a certain quirk. For me, it's one of Jules Verne's best and most eccentric. I mean, sure, Captain Nemo can be seen as eccentric, but he's always struck me as misanthropic. I mean, why else would he skulk around the sea in a submarine? But Fogg is eccentric and a man of the world, a man on a mission. I mean, that's why Doctor Who suited me so well. He was Phineas Fogg, but traveling through time and space. Whenever I started writing a story, I always begin with the characters first, and I try to give them a quirk, an eccentric attribute, something that makes them pop. I draw a little bit from Fogg, Passepartout, and Fix, and really those three characters ought to be exhausted from overuse. But that well hasn't run dry yet.